What's happening, people? I hope you're all well. So, what's it like to be a man in 2023? Point blank, straight up, it's not easy. And it's not easy for a variety of reasons. And I'm really going to delve in and explore these reasons. So, the first reason I want to highlight is the fact that a lot of what was considered desirable and good behavior and desirable traits and strength and value is now seen as very undesirable. So before, being aggressive, being strong, being emotionally robust, these were seen as desirable traits in past times, because in past times, when your next meal wasn't guaranteed and you were living in mud houses and there was less stability, you needed to be emotionally robust, you needed to be strong, you needed to be, perhaps sometimes some would say, cold. And it certainly wouldn't have benefited you to be in your feelings, to be feminine, to be, someone who expresses their emotions and cries. So in past times, the whole idea of being brutal at times, cold, emotionally robust, these were seen as desirable traits, because this would have better ensured your survival in a harsh climate. However, a lot of what was considered desirable is now considered undesirable. Now you're seen as a caveman if you act like this. Now you're seen as toxic masculinity. And this really does highlight something that I want to talk about here, and that is the fact that, and it's a bit of a side note, but it's also true, many things are circumstantial. In the universe, many things are not fixed. A lot of things are subject to subjectivity and circumstantial. So in past times, let's say 1,000 years ago, if you were cold but you got the job done, the women would flock to you. But now if you're cold, there's a chance that you're going to be seen as someone who exhibits traits that some would refer to as toxic masculinity. So being a man in 2023 is not easy, because a lot of what is in your heart with regards to masculinity and your subconscious is telling you is good, society is telling you is not good. So you're almost having to tone it down, tone your masculinity down in the workplace, tone your masculinity down when you're at gatherings, so that you can appease the people around you. And obviously your brain doesn't like that, so then you become a bit depressed. Another reason why being a man in 2023 is not easy is because what was expected of you and what you were judged by in the past is still prevalent and is still there, but it's become 1,000 times harder to achieve. So in past times, and I'm not talking about 1,000 years ago now, I'm talking about maybe the 1950s, people would assess you by your job, assess you by what woman was on your arm, assess you by what house you lived in, assessed you by, do you have kids, are you married? And these would be the assessments that people would make and the criteria that people would judge you on. Now fast forward to 2023, you're still judged by that same criteria. You are still assessed by that same criteria. The only difference is it's 1,000 times harder to achieve and maintain. So a lot of men and a lot of guys in past generations, I find that my parents' generation, I'm not specifically talking about my parents, but my parents' generation, so people who are like in their 50s or 60s, that range, they're not people who were young a million years ago, but I don't think they get it as much as, say, men in my age bracket, the 20s to 30s age bracket. So for men in this age bracket, it is very hard for the average guy to attract a woman. The average guy. So a lot of you watching this, some of you might be saying, "Oh, I get women easy all day." I'm not talking about above average or high value men. I'm talking about average men and below average men, which, by the way, is the majority. So it's very hard for the average man to find a woman. Not impossible, but very hard. Women are becoming less and less accessible because they're now having access to the high value men because of online. And, women only want the top men. This is something to do with nature and biology, which I'm not going to get into in this video. But women are only really attracted to the top men and are willing to share a man if need be. They won't tell you that. So it's very hard for the average man to find a woman. He's going to have to approach hundreds of women, or I might be exaggerating a little bit, but quite a lot of women on the street or in the bars or the clubs to get one number, and then that number to actually call him back, or reply to his texts and calls. It's going to be hard for him to go online. Even slightly above average men are going to struggle online because women get thousands of messages. So he's going to be messaging for one reply, and then he might have to get ignored, and then message another woman, and then to actually get a woman is actually hard for the average guy. And then to actually maintain that relationship and turn it into something that prospers long term, that's even more of a challenge, and it can go wrong at any moment. And women have options all the time. There is always 10 guys standing in line waiting to take your girl from you. So it's very hard. And then let's move on to something else. Job security is not what it was. You got people saying the 1920s, or let's say the 1950s, and they would work for that same company for 20, 30 years. That doesn't happen anymore. And with that, financial security is not what it was. It's a lot harder to move out of mum and dad's house now. And so you're still judged by that same criteria. Where's your girlfriend? Are you married? How many kids have you got? Most marriages, or at least 50% of marriages, don't work anymore. So even what I'm saying here is it's a lot harder to achieve this criteria that men are judged on. But at the same time, even if you achieve it, it can go wrong at any time, and it's a lot more likely to go wrong than it was with my parents and their parents' generation. It's a lot more likely to go wrong with this generation and the ones below me. So it's not easy to be a man in 2023. I'm not saying it's easy to be a woman, but I'm not talking about that in this video. That's not the topic of this video for any women watching this. I don't mean that in a harsh way. It's just not. So it's not easy. Men are judged by the same criteria that they always have been, or at least for recent history. And it's a lot harder to even achieve that, and maybe even harder to maintain it long term. You got the girl, but who's to say she's going to stay with you? You got the kids, who's to say that you're always going to live with them full time and you're not going to be put on child support? You got the marriage, who's to say you're not going to get divorced? You got the job, who's to say you're not going to be made redundant or sacked, or you're going to get cancelled or whatever? You got the house, but it's a lot more expensive. So what cost have you got that house? And what house have you got? You might get less for your money these days. So it's a lot harder. It's very hard to be a man in 2023. You're judged by the same traditional criteria, but it's a lot harder to obtain and maintain. Another reason why it's hard to be a man in 2023 is simply because there's not a lot of support networks in these days and times for men. One thing about women that I have noticed is that they tend to have much more of a support network to fall back on when things go wrong. If a woman posts something on social media about, how terrible her life is going, or something has happened and it's upset her, you will see people in droves go to comfort her. For men, I'm not saying it never happens, but it's a lot less likely. Women in general tend to be a little bit better at forming social networks. And again, I'm not going to go in, this isn't about female nature. But as a result of that, women have more people to fall back on when things go wrong. People tend to be a bit more sympathetic towards women than they do towards men. So in days and times where there's not a lot of sympathy towards men, and to be fair, there never really was, but in a time, these are times, where people are less sympathetic towards men, and there's not a lot of support networks for men. Male suicide is something that does occur. Male depression is something that does occur. And there's not a lot of support networks for men. I'm not saying there's none, but there's not a lot. I mean, if you think about it, there are far more organizations that support women than organizations that support men. And if you look at all these marches that happen based on things that affect women, how many marches do you see in support of men who don't get access to their children, men who get divorced and taken to the cleaners? How many marches do you see about these things? None. And here's the thing, I'm going to quickly talk about female-owned group preference, which basically covers the topic that, typically speaking, men support women, women support women, but hardly anyone supports men. And this is true. It's very, very true. So it's not easy to be a man in 2023. It's really not easy. I'm not saying that you need to, give up, get depressed about it, but if we're going to talk real, it's not easy to be a man in 2023. But of course you can't give up. You got to look at the situation you're in, and I've said this before, look at the situation you're in, assess it, and just make the best of it. But it's not easy to be a man in 2023, and I'm just going to keep it real. So what do you think about what I've said in this video? Have I left anything out? And your contributions are appreciated. Let me know. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, hit the notification bell so you get a notification when I make a new video, and I'll see you on the next video.